and I'm Nick Bridge, the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change in FCDO, and we'll jump straight in with Andrew Steer, President and CEO of WRI, the World Resources Institute, and his colleagues who are also on the line, with particular thanks to Ed for making this happen and being such an intellectual and supportive voice in our COP work at the moment, and Leo in London and Helen in Washington, and Graham also advising COP, Sir Graham Wynne. And we've got a range of colleagues in Whitehall. So in order to go straight to Andrew, could I just reiterate what Ed said to those who were on the line earlier? And could people just jot in the chat who they are and where they're from? And of course, any particular questions on their minds or provocations for the wider group, because it would be nice to get a bit of a sense of a chat and a dialogue going during Andrew's remarks, so that we can dive into a discussion as soon as he's finished. Andrew was formerly of this parish as the Director General in DFID, and there's many other strong links to the UK government, and is very closely engaged on our COP work. And the whole of WRI works around the world with our network as well, diplomatically and in a variety of policies and programmatic capacities. So this is a rich relationship and part of a critical network of friends and co-conspirators as we build momentum through this year. It really is, and I think we can get into hyperbole, but this really is the year of all years. By the end of which, I think Andrew has said, we will find out what kind of civilization we really are. So Andrew will speak and do his pitch up front, and we will then all come in on the back of that, and I'll just sort of to an extent steer that through. So Andrew, thank you, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and congratulations what you and your colleagues are doing right now. This coming year is a very, very important one, and the United Kingdom sits absolutely at the center of it. So it's a great honor to be with you. Let me share my screen. Look, each year we've been doing this for the last 15 or so years. In December, we get some of our brightest young people around our institute, and we say, but what are the 5 or 6 big stories? And it's a very good discussion. We have it in December and early January. And then we sort of land on some stories. This year, obviously, is a very serious year, so it tends to be slightly more serious set here. There's a lot to cover as well, so I'll talk quickly. Look, it's been obviously an amazing year. If you go to the pandemic, you'll see, in round numbers, 100 million infected, 2 million dead. If you look at the cost of the pandemic, 22 trillion is sort of an average estimate, but Larry Summers at Harvard, his calculations show $16 trillion just for the United States. World Bank and others have estimated 100 million have fallen into poverty. And if we go to the next slide, it's exposed incredible inequity. I mean, in the United Kingdom, the average Black or Muslim is 1.3 times as likely to catch COVID. In the United States, it's 2.3 for a Black person compared to a white person. So huge unfairness. This was the hottest year in history in Europe and the equal hottest year worldwide. And in addition to that, there were, next slide, the worst fires that we've ever had in Brazil, Australia, California, locust infections in the Horn of Africa, a 70-year high for that. The largest number of strong hurricanes hit landfall in the Atlantic season. Next slide. And obviously we all got used to Zoom, whether talking to our girlfriends and boyfriends or whether G20 leaders. It's been a remarkable year, not always been unified. Well done, you got through Brexit in a pretty, well, it wasn't as the crisis we feared. And next slide, an extraordinary election. I mean, I'm sure you saw the television yesterday. I mean, the first African American, the first Asian American, the first woman as vice president. Astonishing. Next slide. We had an attempted coup in this country 2 weeks ago, but yesterday we showed actually that democracy did work. I mean, it was totally inspiring yesterday. Next slide. And amidst all of this sort of woe, astonishing progress, a vaccine in record time, and also 2020 was the year that polio was eradicated in Africa. Remarkable. So the first story is the big Uber story. What to watch? How will we reset? Next slide. Lots of people have been writing. You may have read Arundhati Roy's piece in the Financial Times a few months ago. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past, imagining their world anew. This one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And that's led lots of people to say, what are the lessons? And the lessons are pretty striking. We're much more vulnerable than we thought. We failed to address social justice issues. We need to cooperate much more. We need science much more, but we can adapt. And we need community. So those are some of the lessons. And of course, that's led to a lot of speculation. You know, Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, writes, well, we had the era of the state after World War II. We then had Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the liberalization of China, 140 countries privatizing, deregulating, and that was the era of the market. And what are we going into now? We don't want to go back to what we had. And so whole series of suggestions, the era of community, the era of cooperation, resilience, tribalism, deglobalization, and so on. Next slide. Obviously, the sort of starting point in any reset has to be inequality and social justice. I mean, it's quite astonishing, actually, just how unequal countries have become within themselves. Even although equality across countries has shrunk, inequality within countries has grown enormously. That has to be a starting point in anything. Next slide. And what to watch this year? We will know by the end of this year whether it is a K-shaped recovery, where some do fine, they bounce back, others are left behind, geographically in terms of sectors. A litmus test will be the vaccine, who gets it and when, and as the head of the WHO, Tedros, said just 2 days ago, the way we're heading at the moment is a catastrophic moral failure. Rich countries buying more than they need, and poor countries having to fight amongst each other, driving up prices. What to watch in terms of who we become as a civilization this year? What happens to bilateral aid? What happens to multilateral aid? Will there be a special IDA? Very controversial. And what will we see for debt forgiveness in the G20? June's a very important month for debt forgiveness. Next slide. So also, what to watch is sort of are corporations continuing to evolve? This is Milton Friedman. 50 years ago exactly, he said there's only one purpose for a corporation, and that is to maximize profits and shareholder value. But now there's a sort of a mantra that we're moving from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. And the UK and Europe's at the very heart of this, and what Nigel Topping and others are doing in terms of sort of getting the corporates to lead. Watch this year in terms of shareholder meetings, in terms of Davos in Singapore in May, and watch each of the major events and the role that the private sector plays. Also, next slide, watch trade this year. Hopefully a month from today, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala will be the head of the WTO, would be an amazing new era for an institution that has shriveled up in relevance in the last 4 years, and indeed in the last 10 years. I mean, the rules-based system has broken down. Can she, together with the enlightened countries of the world, including the UK and the US, sort of start getting things right? Watch global supply chains. Will we see, if you like, deglobalization? Not necessarily a bad thing, but it depends how it happens. Next. And finally, watch sort of the rebounding of multilateralism. G20 has been a failing institution over the last couple of years. When you think about the seriousness of the problems that we face, look at the irrelevance of their decision making. But it's going to change now. or is it? Watch the G7, well done. Back to the previous slide. Watch the G7, which you guys are hosting. Watch the G20 in October and read the Secretary General's important report, which he's been instructed to deliver at UNGA this year on the future of multilateralism and the UN. And watch not only what the report says, but watch how it lands. So that's, if you like, the first Uber story that will feed into all the other stories. Story number two, what will happen to the biggest economic stimulus in history? Could be $20 trillion. So far, yes, next slide. So far, you'll see how it's allocated. You know, basically about 10 trillion pounds have been allocated, and basically we, the rich countries, are reflating our own economies, and so far very, very little is going to the developing world. Watch how this develops this coming year. Next slide. And obviously, you know, leaders like Kristalina are making statements to say, look, this isn't only about how we reshape our economies, it's about our entire future, the civilization. And what does she mean by that? If you go to the next slide, basically, she's saying, look, there is a win-win here, and the UK government is at the frontiers of this point. There's a win-win. You want to get people back to work. The best way to do it is to invest in tomorrow's economy, not yesterday's. And go to our website and look up Building Back Better. You'll see an amazing set of data that show how investing in greener futures will be better. This slide simply shows how it's going so far. It takes the allocated money so far, and then it asks how much of that can we ascribe either to green, environmentally sustainable investment, or the opposite, the old-fashioned fossil fuel. And this shows sort of how things are doing. The UK is sort of the front of the pack together with the EU, but overwhelmingly, we're not doing very well. If you add the next slide, you'll see that Joe Biden, in his campaign statements, has said that he will look like this. Now, if that is the case, that would be really important and a real game changer. Next slide. So that's the second story, which is watch the biggest reflationary program in history. Story number three. As you can imagine, there's a story on the United States. Will they be able to deliver? Next slide. 7 million more people voted for Biden, and yesterday, of course, we saw the inauguration. What will he do? Next slide. This is his sort of team, if you like. There are many more than this, but all of these are going to be carrying forward the sustainability agenda. You might wonder why Janet Yellen's there. Well, Janet Yellen was a founder of the Carbon Leadership Council, which has been lobbying Congress over the last couple of years. I've been with her to talk to senators, Republican senators, to urge them to put a tax on carbon, for example. The others are all people that you will be engaging with. And, you know, we're very lucky that this is a pretty serious team. Next slide. So what's he been doing so far? Well, yesterday evening, he signed 17 executive orders. He rejoined the Paris Climate Accord that will come into force a month from now. He did all the other things that you've seen. Over the coming 100 days, one will see a lot of such executive orders, basically undoing what Mr. Trump did. And almost all of them will be positive. So that's a good thing. Next slide. What does this imply externally? Well, if he wants to be a leader externally, he has to earn that right. It's not an entitlement. So obviously, we're all looking at what the NDC will look like for the United States. We've done a lot of analysis. Others have too. They could make an offer of between 45 and 50% reduction in emission by 2030 over 2005 levels. So the number, when you're talking to your friends in the United States, the number is 50. They should reduce their emissions. They should commit to reduce their emissions under their NDC by 50%. So what about Congress? Well, as you know, it's balanced. which means it's in the hands of the Democrats because of the deciding vote. We expect another stimulus bill soon, as you know. We will see an infrastructure bill that looks pretty good, I think. There will be investment, which is bipartisan in its support for R&D, for green technologies, for hydrogen, for carbon capture and storage. There's a lot of interest both sides of the aisle on nature-based solutions. And a more controversial one, will there be financing for the Green Climate Fund? Obviously, it's incredibly important that the first thing that Biden tries to get through Congress is the $2 billion that Obama promised but was never delivered to the Green Climate Fund. Next. Now, if you look internationally, a big question is what will be on the agenda at the Global Climate Summit in the first 100 days. And obviously, Nick, you and your colleagues will be talking with the American administration as to what is on that. We're hoping by 100 days that the United States will have something to offer themselves. Has to be some finance there, has to be some degree of commitment, maybe some sectoral transformations. But I think your role, the UK's role, is going to be incredibly important working with John Kerry on that first 100-day summit. Will there be a climate deal with India? We think they could. We help run the track 2 at the moment that's going on. We think there's big opportunities there. And also, obviously, the issue with China. It will not be easy, but perhaps climate change, John Kerry's very good relationship with them already could be very helpful. And will the US step up on climate finance? That's a very difficult issue. As you know, the Senate can stop things happening, and you really need 60% to stop the filibuster. So next, that was story number 3, which was about the United States. Obviously, the other elephant in the room is China. What will it prioritize? First slide. You've seen all this before. If you go to the next slide, it's really that top left-hand corner that everybody talks about. But Xi Jinping and his ministers made all of these announcements in the last few months since UNGA, when he made the carbon neutral statement. It's an incredibly positive statement. But what comes next? Next slide. Well, actually, the reason that he made that commitment is they've done their homework. And their homework shows that actually it makes a lot of sense economically for them. This is work that we did together with Tsinghua University and others that shows that $1 trillion in benefits could come from going to net zero and peaking much earlier. Go to the next slide. What will we expect on the 5-year plan? Obviously, March is an incredibly important month in China. One will see a lot of intensity cut targets, which will look impressive. It's unlikely that the 5-year plan will include actual absolute limits, but the NDC might. And so we don't know when it's coming. But the really important thing is, will they announce a peak emission year of 2026 or 2027? Will they have a cap on coal? Will they extend to additional greenhouse gases? Next slide. Also, this next month, as you know, the carbon market will be finally launched after lots of experimentation. It will immediately become the largest carbon market in the world, slightly bigger than the ETS, even though it will just deal with the power sector. Obviously, everyone should be looking at how strong will the cap be and how quickly will they start talking about extending it to other sectors, and what will their attitude be to some of the other trading systems around the world. Next slide. Also watch, and it's great to hear that the UK is doing some really terrific work with the government of China on the BRI strategy. There will be an international forum. We and many others are working with them on this issue. We actually think that there may well be some good announcements by April on metrics. The conversations we've been having suggest that it's not in their interest, and they realize it, to continue their current reputation. But obviously, as everyone's been reading, the scale may be reduced, and it will be very interesting to see the mix, particularly with regard to coal, which is the big issue, obviously. So that's what to watch. And finally, you know, is there the likelihood of a sort of a G3 emerging, using climate change as something to lower the temperature on what otherwise will be a very difficult set of relationships with China in the coming years? And obviously, President Biden is no dove when it comes to China in terms of security or in terms of trade, but climate could be one of the bridges that could be helpful. So that's the fourth story, and now we're on to the second to last one. You'll be glad to know, nature positive. You guys in the UK deserve incredible credit for the way you've put nature-based solutions on the agenda. Go to the next slide. I mean, basically all of these major events, starting week before last, the One Planet Summit, you know, the Food System Summit, etc. UNGA, G7, you're putting it on the agenda there. The COP for biological diversity, we don't know when it is, but probably the autumn. The Italians are putting it on. The G20, Glasgow, one of the 5 themes, and the ocean meeting, we don't actually know when it's going to be. It may not be till next year, but all of those are putting the issue of nature and food on the agenda. Go to the next slide, and the question is why? And I think really sort of 3 reasons. One, that moving from a 2-degree goal to a 1.5-degree world changed everything in terms of nature, because we realized that it not only had to go down to reduce to almost no emissions from the 25% that it emits now, but it has to pull down something like 15 years of accumulated greenhouse gas emissions into from the atmosphere. So it suddenly becomes an area of focus. Then at the same time, you've got to increase food production by 50%, and a huge amount of work over the last couple of years on a sort of new nature economy, where we've discovered that actually investing smartly in nature is incredibly good for your economy, and it can put people back to work, and it links again to the stimulus. So those are the reasons why this is rising so rapidly, and of course you are at the center of that. Next slide. And so what we're tending to see, things are going in the wrong direction, as you obviously know. Do you remember 2015? We said that under the New York Declaration on Forests, we're going to end tropical forest deforestation by 2020, and instead it went up by more than 40%. And we're now looking at things in a much more holistic way. And again, you guys are at the center of this, sort of an integrated produce, protect, reduce, restore. And you go to Davos now, that's all they're talking about. Go to the Food Summit. This is the kind of framing. Produce more food, protect more area, reduce unnecessary losses and like food loss and waste, and restore 500 million hectares of degraded land. And just on each of those, next slide, on the production side, some pretty interesting things this year. The EU's farm to fork strategy, pretty interesting. Look at the NDCs for in the lead up to the COP. An effort to double funding for CGIAR. These are all very important measures that could, if you like, bend the curve. Next slide. In terms of protect, this is Cornwall. Well done. You picked the best place for the G7. And the question is, at Kunming, will 30% of all land and sea be protected? And obviously, I'm sure you will use the G7 to lock that in, at least for the G7 countries. This is a very, very important decision that the world will make. And it looks like it's going in the right direction. Next. Food loss and waste. The UK, by the way, congratulations. You were the first country in the world to reach the halfway point on SDG 12.3. And if we were you, we would put this on the G7 agenda. Why? Because it's a winning ticket, quite frankly, and it's a win-win thing to do. China's Clean Plate campaign is very, very important. So it's possible this year could really be an inflection point for the food loss and waste. And obviously, you know how important it is. Next slide. On the restoration side, the restore side, good progress. 61 countries now signed up to the Bonn challenge, 210 million committed. What will be important this year is not only to see momentum growing, but actually for the first time ever, we will be able to measure using remote sensing and satellite technology and artificial intelligence. We will be able to measure landscapes being restored, which you've never been able to do before. We can measure forests falling down to 1/10 of a hectare every week, but for the first time ever, we'll be able to do that. This could be transformative in terms of the emerging carbon markets for nature-based solutions. And that leads us to the next slide, which is the most difficult issue I think all of us are facing in the lead up to Glasgow. Will we sort out net zero compensation and offsets? And I think you all know the issues very well indeed. Some of you have proposed a high ambition markets accelerator proposal. Is it possible with tens, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars sitting on the sideline that would love to go in nature-based solutions? Is it possible for us to agree on both the supply side and the demand side guardrails? We'd love to talk to you more about that. So that's the second to last story. And now this is the final story, which brings it all together, the road to Glasgow, which I'm presumably all of you, one way or the other, are involved in, as we are too. So good news, first slide, in terms of what's being committed to net zero. I mean, impossible to imagine that this would happen at the time of Paris. I mean, absolutely incredible. And some of you have been at the very center of that. So too, corporations, next slide, you'll see that at the time of Paris, when we and others started the science-based targets, we thought maybe you could get 100 companies. Now it's over 1,100 companies committed to fully decarbonize throughout their supply chain, a total of 7.7 gigatons if you include scope 3 from these companies. So too on cities, next slide. No one would have dreamt that this would have happened. 10,500 cities committed to net zero. So that's all good. Next slide. We now need to both accelerate it and actually put some meat on the bones. Next slide. We've done a lot of work on this, and I know you have too. Got a note yesterday from Simon Sharp showing similar types of analysis. We basically have to accelerate the acceleration. Bottom right-hand corner, the electricity industries are the only one that's sort of getting close. And of course, what you're trying to do is precisely to get that kind of acceleration. Next slide. Obviously, there are 4 things that need to be done. We need NDCs, we need negotiation of the rules of the game, we need finance, and we need to be successful on the so-called race to zero. And you're at the center of all of these. First on the NDCs, 71 updated so far. And if you press the next button, you'll see that actually 43 of those are actually much more ambitious than before, or at least more ambitious. And yours, Colombia's, even Argentina's, EU's, very good indeed. And some of the vulnerable countries also have done an extremely good job. But obviously, we're nowhere where we need to be. Next slide. So what should we be looking at? Well, obviously, we have to focus on China and the US. Is there some deal that could be done then by the middle of the year? Next slide. What about countries that have committed to net zero but haven't come forward with decadal plans yet in their NDCs? Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Canada. And then there's a group of countries, big important countries, that haven't come forward yet with anything ambitious whatsoever. Who's leading diplomatically? You are in discussing with those, but can we work together on some of those issues? Can we get the UN and the World Bank and others to work? At the moment, it's not yet adding up. Next slide. And what about the laggards? Is there a diplomatic approach? And obviously, you're working on those. Next slide. So that's the NDCs. Second, on the negotiation, and let me not go into this because this is what you work on. Many of you for a day job would love to talk about this. The final one, the finance and solidarity package, is the most difficult. And even though Article 6 is very difficult too, if we can't sort out common timelines and process for global stock take, I mean, we may as well pack up and go home. But the finance and solidarity package and adaptation and loss and damage is exceedingly important. Next slide. And then finance. Alok Sharma, wonderful statement. We must collectively honor the 100 billion. We've just got to. And at the moment, I mean, it's a shambles, quite frankly. I mean, we don't even have a common way of adding it up. There could be without much difficulty. And anyway, we can support you on that. But one of the things that's sort of slightly worrying is that everyone's holding meetings and they're saying, well, it's not a pledging session. Well, when are we going to have the pledging session? Issue of debt forgiveness, I mentioned that earlier. Obviously, Kristalina Georgieva is at the very center of that with the G20. And a very, very important issue, Paris alignment of the MDBs. And I do think, I think probably Alok Sharma is going to go over and meet with David Malpass sometime soon, I hope. You've got a very good team in the World Bank, by the way, Richard Montgomery and so on, spoke to him yesterday. It is essential that the MDBs land together on what it means to be Paris aligned well before Glasgow. And love to talk with you more about that. Next slide, still on finance, obviously, the adaptation story has been seriously neglected. We're hoping next week's summit will really lead to something. We've had the privilege of sort of co-managing the Global Adaptation Commission. We think there's some pretty good things in the offing, but you know, over the year, there ought to now be a sort of coalescing around half of all climate finance for adaptation. But there's some very specific measures as well, happy to discuss, that we need to watch in the coming year. Next slide. And finally, on financing, you know, obviously Mark Carney has a very important role to play. He's doing it well, pretty aggressively. I mean, there's lots of issues, but the two issues to watch the most is commitments to net zero. So far, $9 trillion of assets under management out of about 100 trillion that's in management have committed to net zero. That's good. I mean, we wouldn't have imagined that. That needs to increase, and they need to make an agreement on what it actually means to go to net zero and how they're going to get there. And they need to sign up to science-based targets, which is the path to get to net zero. And I happen to co-chair the HSBC Climate Advisory Group, and they've made a commitment to net zero. And now, you know, we're really trying to help them figure out what does it mean and how you get there. And then obviously the mandatory reporting of climate risk. Will there be more countries that agree to that? And will that become sort of unstoppable? Next slide. And finally, sort of the fourth element, which you guys have done in a way that no one else has ever done in the lead up to a COP, your whole race to zero. And your focus on the sort of sector breakthroughs, the sort of S-curve type things, you know, whether it's the internal combustion engine or shipping or buildings, etc. All good stuff. And important here is not only, and we need to know, you know, what would it be 30 countries that are committed to eliminate the internal combustion engine by 2035? Would that be the sort of the agreement that we're looking for, together with, you know, 6 of the top 10 automobile manufacturers in the world? You know, I mean, this could be a real game changer. Watch it, but it has to be well organized, and we think it is. Next slide. We're very impressed with the way that you and others are really trying to sort of get this point across. Going to 1.5 again was very helpful because it reminded us all there's no incrementality anymore. It's got to be something that's more abrupt, more system change. And the next slide is sort of something that sort of you guys seem to be thinking along these lines, so to speak. Can we get to a tipping point and beyond the stage where we might fall back down? And this is how we have to look at all of the efforts. We've set up something called the System Change Lab, and we put it alongside the COP team in order to try and be helpful in monitoring and learning from these transitions. And next slide, and this is the second to last slide, I think. Look, a fundamental question for us all this year is, will trust be rebuilt? Trust is not good. The COVID pandemic has broken trust. The issue of vaccines has broken trust. The fact that suddenly the rich countries can find, you know, $15 trillion to spend on themselves and are not providing really hardly any extra at all for developing countries. This all makes our job in climate finance and in climate more generally very difficult. And this is a very, very important issue, and is something that we need to take very seriously, because if that trust isn't rebuilt, COP26 may not be the success which we believe it could be, truly transformational. Next slide. Adding everything up, I mean, and these obviously have massive uncertainties around them, but if you look at sort of current policies, today's NDCs before the new set, sort of on average about 2.9 degrees Celsius. If you take all of the net zero targets today, and that's both countries and companies and cities, and you assume that they get on a trajectory to deliver those, you'd be down to 2.1 degrees Celsius. That's quite a thing. It's one way to look at this year. In some ways, you could almost say this is a 1 degree Celsius year potentially. Now, obviously, that's not enough. And obviously, some of these net zero targets are made before they even know what they're really talking about. So there's everything to play for. And finally, last slide, and I hope this makes you feel sleepless at night, because you are the indispensable leader for 2021. You won't be every year, but this is the year when we all have to pull our socks up and deliver something really remarkable. And let me say, from WRI's standpoint, you know, count on us. So back to you, Nick. Oh, those are the stories.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks so much. Let's go back to the big screen, and people raise their hand and come in on the chat, but brilliant, thank you, Andrew. I've listened to previous years' versions, but this one has really turned up the temperature, so no pressure. I want to just start maybe by reflecting on maybe two broad themes, but just before I do that, would Ed or Graham, Helen, David, Leo want to add anything from where they sit in the WRI family, to draw any of that out, or give us any further reflections over your team? Graham, do you want to add anything?
No, I was going to suggest we want to hear from you, please.
Yeah. Okay. No, well, thank you. And I mean, my two sort of clusters of comment question would be around, first, what's the narrative? And it's a question and a comment. What's the narrative in civil society? So much has changed since Paris, but one of the things that's changed and that we grapple with every day is that everything is now on the table. You know, the entire global economy, financial system, natural world, environment knitting together with climate and economics and finance, everybody coming together, which is a sign of success and what needs to happen. But it makes it much harder to think of what the narrative is that captures this and energizes the world, but also gives us a headache for being so demanding. You know, drop the debt, stop climate chaos. What I'm interested in, what people think feels like will run us through the year, because a lot of people will find it very hard. There's still very low public recognition of what net zero means, and very low public understanding of human causes of climate. Even nearly everybody now is very concerned about it. Still a minority, I think it's anything to do with us and our economy. It's very striking that we are still in a bubble, and we need to not be in one. So I'm interested in just what we think that narrative is around, because as Neil said in the chat, so much is out there around inequality, Black Lives Matter, and all of those, you know, ongoing populist strains, and so on. So I think it's tricky to try and work out. You know, we're doing our absolute best, I think, to, you know, channel people towards COP. The net zero framing does feel like it's working, and I think it will start to break through as a widely understood concept. You know, stopping a contribution to climate change, and then doing so sooner, you know, with very specific targets. I think that will crack through, but I just wonder how the civil society will try and corral all of this and pull together and be successful in influencing governments. So that's sort of one broad set of questions. I think linked to that is another real concern that again, I think Neil mentioned, or somebody did, just those numbers up front about how much stimulus is going on in the rich world, or the industrialized world, and how little elsewhere. And I think the thing that currently keeps us up most is the finance question, and the delivering for the vulnerables, and accessing that finance, and just the extent to which there's a small number of countries that have really caused all of this, and will only shift so far, no matter how successful we are. And will that be enough to hold the coalition together? And there's a lot of concern now. Land temperature this year up 1.96 degrees with a standard error of 0.4, so basically 2 degrees on land since pre-industrial levels already. And so the coalition in 2015 that said 1.5, Europe, SIDS, and many in Africa, was so powerful, so important. And the 1.5 report was so powerful and so important. Yet, that is at risk of fracturing, because we're not able to deliver, as Andrew says, on finance. So it's that whole question of sort of what's the narrative, and how can we hold it together in the most positive but realistic way. The second big area I think that I'd be really interested in wider views on is what's going on outside our world, if you like. I'm thinking particularly of this risk of a bifurcation in the global economy. The two internet systems, the two digitals, the two technological tracks, the sort of US and China, in a sense, lead these two worlds. And climate and the green transition is exactly what's going to start to put that dynamic under pressure, because we all know how Germany and Spain invested in solar, and now look, China's taken that market, and there's the moves afoot in Europe and the US to ensure that in other sectors, hydrogen, vehicles, rare earths, that we retain competitiveness. So I suppose I encapsulate my second big observation around collaboration versus competition, and actually how that will play out, because we've got to a world where we are now dependent for success on engendering a sense of competition. We want countries to outbid each other on their NDCs and the net zero targets, because they see an economic advantage. And Andrew, you did the study in China, which was extraordinarily powerful number. Yet to get there at the moment, it is in a world economy that is not, of one mind. And so I'm very interested in that push-pull in reality as we push forward with Simon and others, our sectoral transformations, and we try to hold everyone together on a collaborative but competitive path. Competition always has two sides to it. It has a kind of barriers side and a protectionist side, and it has a kind of market leader, maximalist. We want the biggest market in order to take advantage of our competitive advantage and our competitive share. So I think that's the second big sort of question, is realpolitik, particularly in the US, when they think about China, they think about trade. There's a challenge there to not put climate in a separate State Department, rather legal and negotiating mindset. And those two things obviously need to be melded, both in the US system and in the Chinese system and elsewhere. So I'll stop really with those two broad observations, and just as I've been jabbering away, just checking whether others have come in. No, I mean, do you want to reflect a bit on that, Andrew and Graham and others? But other colleagues in Whitehall, please do hand and comment.
Well, those are wonderful, huge comments. That could get us going for quite a long time. I'd really be interested in other people's thoughts on that. Helen, I wonder whether you want to, on that first one, the narrative. And then I don't know whether Wanjira's on the line. She was going to join us. Helen, do you want to go first?
Huge apologies, Andrew. I had to drop off for an interview, so I just came back and I actually missed the question on the narrative. Sorry about that. It's all
okay.
About the US, so sorry.
Oh, okay. So what Nick was saying is, how do we create a narrative that makes this irresistible? It's all very well saying, you know, let's do it. But I mean, we've got to forgive debt. We've got to reflate our own economies. We've got to, you know, increase our taxes. We've got to increase foreign aid. We've got to do this, this, this. And whilst everyone wants to do something about climate change, this is not necessarily a particularly attractive menu in front of us, sort of thing. So, is there a kind of a narrative? And he particularly asked it, which was actually very interesting in the context of civil society. You know, is civil society unified on this? And of course, the answer is not necessarily. I mean, so we come at this, and I think most of you do too. You know, we demonstrate with quite a bit of technical expertise, I think, that this is very good for your economy. And Helen's team, together with the whole New Climate Economy group in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Ethiopia, in the United States, in China, have demonstrated that actually it's good economics. And we've nailed that to some extent, not we, but the world, the best economists in the world now would say smart climate action leads to more economic efficiency, it leads to new technologies, and it leads to lower risk. Those three things combined lead to more investment, better jobs, and especially at this time of reflation, you know, skate to where the puck is going to be. Invest in tomorrow's economy, not yesterday's, sort of thing. And we've got all the numbers to show that. Now, that's not a narrative that all the NGOs would sign up to. But what we then say, and I mean, Helen, I would say, has pivoted the New Climate Economy in a pretty important way. And you guys in the UK government have been very influential in this, towards, you know, the just transition, because the environmental movement has neglected people, and the economists that looking at growth have neglected people, and we need to think quite differently. And Yamid's come on the line. So Yamid, you may have a thought, because Yamid, who used to be a negotiator for the United Kingdom, now leads our work on some of the low-income and vulnerable countries.
And Andrew, if I could say something briefly before Yamid comes in on the vulnerable and low-income countries. I do think that's exactly right, Nick. You're very well aware of and have been instrumental in helping us with that sort of new climate economy narrative and landing that around the world. It's incredibly important. It is starting to land in some countries. I would say to what Andrew said, there's two things that are needed now. One is that the broader narrative, we're getting decision makers, leaders, government, business, investors are starting to get it. That's all fine, but it won't do anything unless it means something in terms of what they individually can do. What can happen in a given country? What will that generate in terms of potential jobs, poverty reduction, gender benefits, health benefits, etc. And so what we're doing, and a number of others are doing, is trying to take that down to the local level. We're doing it in Indonesia, and in fact, have just with the Ministry of Planning rerun some of the modeling work we've done with them before to look specifically at the COVID-19 economic realities and how more ambition on climate could lead to even better outcomes in terms of the economic recovery. Similarly, we're doing that in a number of other countries. Colombia, that landed well just before they put in their NDC. How we can actually do this in countries depends on, first of all, getting it country specific. Second of all, addressing some of the real political economy concerns. So even in Indonesia, Ministry of Planning is buying into it. We've got a few others. Others are not on board. We're not yet getting to a point where a whole of government approach comes together behind it. And part of the element of that political economy is absolutely looking at who loses. Even if there's net gains overall, somebody is losing. And if they have powerful voices in terms of influencing government, in terms of lobbying, you need to find ways to address that, to bring them along. In some cases where that's sort of low income groups, farmers, et cetera, you need to find ways that they have an alternative approach that will work for them locally, again, country specific. Where it's others, you need to find ways where you can actually bring forward more powerful voices who will be able to counter some of those lobbying. So that's really what we're trying to do country by country with some of the key countries we're working with. But Yamid, please.
And then I'm keen as time, because you need to close at 12. So let's keep our comments very short, and then I'd love to hear from more from the UK government.
Yeah, I'll bring in, we've got a particularly large contingent of nature and forestry specialists. So I'd just like to bend a bit to that because it's been such a new thing, as you say, Andrew, particularly for us. But Yamid.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully I will touch upon, that last question. I think what I see emerging in a more unified way within the civil society is that narrative around solidarity and trust. So, and the why is really, you know, the equity, social justice, inequity, kind of that dimension. On the how is really that sense of this adequacy of finance needed to really turn, you know, planning into action, and to do that with equity. So, you know, there's a sense that yes, finance, and there was a question within in the chat, you know, even the faith-based community, you know, from the Vatican to local level, there's discussions about how to mobilize also finance. So, and those you know, constituencies are talking about, you know, social, racial justice as well, you know, in that dimension. In another, specifically on the forest, you know, one area of, you know, how to build trust that is also linked with, you know, finance is, you know, how to deal with the emerging and more sensitive issue of carbon markets. So without entering into the details, and we can follow up, you know, offline, I think, you know, until Madrid, you know, what has changed since Madrid, until Madrid, it was mainly an issue between country, and then we've seen that there's more, you know, interest from the private sector into this issue, and there's a perceived risk that there could be a water down, that could water down the rules on carbon markets. So how to, you know, to produce the right level of engagement and discussions on how to support, to finance, you know, nature-based solutions, you know, forest action, and also use the market in a consistent and robust way is going to be also, you know, at play. But we can discuss this afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Yamid.
No,
Could we
really helpful.
the British government?
We just looked. That's really helpful, Yamid, and I agree with sort of the fair finance and finance and access to finance. And this is no surprise the hardest part at the moment, I think, of our intergovernmental discussions, and that's why it's so important to have the civil society and business voice coming in and supporting it. I think we lost Sean, but as I say, I don't know if Katie or Neil or someone wants to just reflect on Andrew's points around nature and how that feels that's going as a unifying agenda. Protection of forests and so on is something that resonates more than reducing emissions from power plants, for example. Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to come in, or Jenny? I don't know if you're still on the line in terms of the programmatic work you're leading.
I'm happy to share a few thoughts, Nick. Thanks,
Great.
Andrew. First of all, thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I think nature alone as a sort of unifying theme is probably not sufficient. You know, I think we need to think about some of the economic and social impacts that developing countries are facing too. I mean, just to give you a very sort of stark kind of illustration, and this is, you know, very much in confidence and between friends, but currently in one of our big country offices in one of the poorest countries in the world, they're modelling cuts of, you know, sort of 60–70% to humanitarian programs, and it's also a country which is important for the nature agenda. And you know, there's a sort of element of obscenity if you cut humanitarian programs and then come in and say, now we'd like to work with you on nature. So the nature alone as a sort of unifying theme, I don't think works. It's in fact it's a trap we've got to avoid falling into, where nature is important for us. You know, we're I think very, you know, sort of influenced by what you'd call Western conservation agenda, which we bring into all of our work on supply chains and agricultural reforms, and you know, whatever else you see us coming in through that lens, and it doesn't necessarily land well on the other side, and it doesn't necessarily land well with other countries that, you know, in the emerging category or the LDC categories that you were pointing to. So yeah, that would be my sort of overall reflection on that. Yeah, the sort of point about narratives important, and how you swim against this this current that's running, you know, the stimulus, inequality that's going to entrench, the vaccines which are going to further compound the impacts of that, and yet the need for cooperation to overcome with that there's a challenge, and many others. So I did like the optimistic spin that you put on your presentation. And unfortunately, it's not. I can't quite internalise that myself, and I perceive some massive challenges. I don't see quite how we get past them yet, but I hope to get to that point. More seminars like this.
I think it draws out, though, Neil, a very important sort of political stance, and I know I find myself saying more and more with ministers that for me there's this combination of humility and competence. And you've got to, a lot of this is in the political, tone, which I think Joe Biden has already begun to work with, but also just the competence around showing. We've had some great feedback, actually, mainly on just the regularity and rhythm and openness of our contacts with a lot of countries. So simply laying that ground, and I think that's an important lesson for us. I don't know, Rachel or others, do you want to comment on any of the nature side? Or Andy, you were picking up the trust and inequality as well and are working on that. Please just dive in the interest of time.
Oh, hello. I'll try. Oh, yes. Just on the nature side. I mean, I agree with what Neil says about, I think sort of selling the nature story as such is not really, may not be helpful and may seem, quite out of line with what developing countries in particular are going through at the moment. But I think the way to address that, and in fact, the point that I think we are trying to raise with our COP campaign is that this is it's not about just nature for the sake of it. It's about our long-term future. It's about food security. It's about health. It's about economic growth. And what we're sort of trying to press for is ways that we can combine our short-term needs for all of those things with the long-term sustainability. And for that to happen, we depend on nature. So I think it's got to be an approach about, yes, we want to help address the short-term issues and inequalities, but in order to build that in for the future and to avoid ever worsening crisis, we have to take account now of the sustainability of our natural ecosystems. So if we can kind of wed it into that language, then I think, we've got a better chance of getting people engaged. And to me, that is actually the point, is the long-term development needs. Thanks.
We have to just wrap up in a couple of minutes, but we do want to bring people in. And David, I fully agree with your comment on trade in response to my sort of challenge. I think that for me, Andrew, what is something else that comes out strongly from the WRI presentation is that this is the year we've sort of at least brought the environmental and climate communities together, but we've got very, very little time to bring the trade and climate and the finance and climate communities together, or perhaps that's or in itself an overly climate or environment focused lens. I mean, what we really want is for Janet Yellen and her crew, and Ngozi, if she's appointed, and her crew to see this absolutely core business, and for to be clear, including from advice from the likes of yourselves, how they can get a quantum of success in very short order. David, I couldn't agree more. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, or?
No, except to say that I think we'd be keen to work with you to develop ways that that might in fact advance.
Yeah, it's always flies by. But Katie, do you want to come in quickly on to elaborate on that, or Andy? Please just do jump in and put your screen on. We're very modest in this government, where we demurely keep ourselves on blank, but we're yeah. Hi, Katie.
Hey, no, just thank you, everyone. It's been super interesting, and we are trying to take forward the great work that you guys are doing, particularly on the analysis around the long-term economic benefits to communities who do invest in this stuff, and apply that to our work on nature. So keep doing more of that. We need more analysis on why it makes sense for specific countries to make these investments and change their economies. But thanks so much for your presentation.
Graham.
Can I just say, we haven't got time, but I think the question of how we multiply our efforts to get the narrative out over the next 6 months we haven't really addressed. So absolutely, there's no point in having a narrative unless it's based on substance. And I think mobilizing finance is critical to having the trust and the substance. But then there is just a technical and resource question in getting the message out there. And on another occasion, I don't think, to be fair, despite all of our wonderful efforts through the COP team, that we've yet got a strategy which mobilizes all of the intermediaries we need to get to communicate to different parts of society. And I think doubling down on that as just a rather boring logistical point would be incredibly helpful, as well as fixing the substance. Over.
That's absolutely right. And this is the big difference between Paris and Glasgow, isn't it? Around the way that this now brings in tens of thousands of companies, tens of thousands of new actors who have new networks and new voices. So thank you, and I completely agree on our comms side is something that we're focused on. I mean, I was going to conclude by sort of, from my point of view, by saying, obviously, then there's the wild cards, Andrew. You've mentioned all the things that you know, the unknowns and the known unknowns as to that may or may not shape the narrative. And I'm indeed thinking of a piece of work about, you know, making things even harder still by saying that, you know, even with net zero and even getting ourselves more on track, there is so much in terms of tipping points and uncertainty around the mean or the average. In terms of extreme events, we could have drought into food baskets, who knows? But I think your framework, as far as we do know, was a brilliant starting point for us. And I want to thank you, WRI. Now is your time. I don't think it's just the UK that's in the dock. I think WRI's entire sort of modus operandi is right for 2021. So I just want to thank you and recognise, as Ed said on the email, there are numerous colleagues who wanted to join but just have to be in other places. So the idea of recording and then putting it online, and there were lots of apologies that didn't go through from people who wanted to join who couldn't. So this helps a wider group reach this conversation. So thank you, Andrew. Could I give you the last word?
Well, just to thank you. Look, it's a great honor to be with you guys. You are at the center of things. You made an interesting point. You're all modest. You don't have your cameras on. All the WRI people have put their cameras on. So we have to be aggressive. You know, we're an NGO, for heaven's sake. So we have to be in your face. So, but it's a real joy to work with you guys. And you've got so many things coming along. I take away from this that there is there's a piece of work to be done on the narrative. There is enough evidence out there to show that actually it's an exciting journey. It's good for people, it's good for communities, it's good for the economy, it's good for health, it's good for, but we haven't yet added it up. And what my job in the next 6 months is to get Neil to cheer up and see this wonderful, no, I'm kidding, Neil, because you're right. We aren't at the stage we really made it sing, and we need to do it. And we would love to work with you on that. Yamid has an offer to you and others on this so-called Act 25 to bring together vulnerable and low-income countries together on a sort of track 2 to really get them all to get excited about it. Because, you know, there's something really interesting. You know, the biggest unexpected to me was when the IPCC came out and said 2 degrees not enough, it's 1.5 degrees, suddenly leaders of corporations and cities around the world came out of the woodwork and said, this is our moment. This is an adventure. You know, and the number committing to science-based targets increased. Why? Because they suddenly realized there was something incredibly exciting. There's a new economy out there, and there's a new society out there. And so I would love to really to work with you on that. Just one final challenge. You have a big, you know, one of your arms tied behind your back because of the ODA cut back by 1/3. The wonderful thing about the commitment to cut it was that it was temporary. How cool it would be if the United Kingdom were to announce it was temporary, it was for 1 year, and next year we're going back to 0.7. That would be fantastic. Because otherwise, quite frankly, it's very, very hard for the UK to build trust the way that it needs to be built. even although you're 0.5 degrees, 0.5% is still generous, that's not the way people look at it. So I just wanted to leave with a little bit of edge.
Thank you. Fantastic. We've overrun, but that was great, and there's never enough time. We'll log all the comments as well, but I think the narrative point is really important and a good one to finish on. And thanks to all the contributions and to everyone for joining. And let's spread this around. And good luck with the World Bank.
Well done.
Push them
Thanks
hard.
so much. Great to see you all.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew.